Welcome to The Explainer. You know, the way we talk about gender and sexuality has completely changed over the last few decades. It's been this huge shift from street protests all the way to dense academic theory. So today, we're going to trace that journey. It's a really complex and fascinating one, from the Stonewall riots all the way to what we now call queer theory. All right, so first things first, what even is gender studies? It's easy to think of it as just one thing, but it's really not. It's this super broad, interdisciplinary field. I mean, it pulls from so many different areas to look at how gender gets formed and represented, the history of oppressed groups, and, really importantly, how gender connects with all these other parts of our identity, like race, class, and so on. And yeah, when we say interdisciplinary, we're not kidding. Think of it like a mashup of all these different fields. You've got literary and cultural theory, sociology, anthropology, even psychoanalysis. All of them bring their own tools and perspectives to the table. It's this incredible meeting point for different ways of understanding the world. Okay, so here's the plan for our explainer. We'll start with what gender studies is. We've kind of touched on that. Then we'll jump to the Stonewall turning point, look at the split between feminism and lesbian separatism, chart the rise of queer theory, and finally meet some of the pioneers of modern theory. Sound good? Let's go. All right, first stop, the Stonewall turning point. This is really about that shift from repression to open rebellion. So, to really get what happened at Stonewall, you have to understand the pressure that was building. After World War II, you start to see these gay communities popping up in the margins of big cities. But then comes the 1950s, and with it, this massive wave of repression and backlash. It was this constant push and pull. And then, in 1969, it all just explodes. The Stonewall riots weren't just a one-night thing. It was the sustained resistance to police harassment. It really was the spark that lit the fire for a whole new era of political solidarity and activism. And here's a really important point. This didn't just come out of nowhere. You know, these things never do. The seeds were being planted for a long time in the world of art and culture. You had incredible writers like Oscar Wilde and James Baldwin, artists like Andy Warhol. They were already pushing boundaries and exploring these themes in their work. So this sense of a shared identity, this gay self-consciousness, was already bubbling up long before Stonewall. Okay, so this new solidarity was powerful, but it also started to create some cracks from within, which brings us to feminism and lesbian separatism, a kind of schism from inside the movement. So this is where things get really interesting. You had mainstream feminism, which was often working with this idea of a universal female identity, right? A kind of we're all in this together as women vibe. But a lot of lesbian critics were saying, hang on a second, that doesn't really include us. They argued that this universal identity actually erased their specific experiences. Their take was that real feminism, the purest form, meant total autonomy from men. This was a huge deal because it basically blew up the idea of a single unified womanhood and forced everyone to think about identity in a much more nuanced way. And right in the middle of this debate was an absolutely brilliant poet and theorist named Adrienne Rich. In 1980, she came up with this really powerful new way of thinking about the bonds between women. She called it the lesbian continuum. And what she meant by that wasn't strictly about sexual experience. It was so much broader. It was about this whole spectrum of woman-identified experiences, things like deep friendships, supporting each other, bonding together against male power structures. It was a complete game changer in how people thought about female relationships. And Adrienne Rich was definitely not a lone voice here. A whole intellectual movement was taking shape. You had groups like the Radical Lesbians and thinkers like Jill Johnston, Monique Wittig, Gloria Anzaldúa. They were all building this case for a distinct lesbian identity, one that stood on its own, separate from mainstream feminism, and also from the gay rights movement, which was often focused on gay men. So you can see how the ground was being prepared, right? All these intense debates about identity and who belongs where. It all created the perfect conditions for the next big thing in the 1990s, the rise of queer theory. This is where the questions got even bigger and way more radical. People started asking, what if identity itself isn't this fixed, stable thing we're born with? What if the categories we use every day, like gay or straight, man or woman, aren't actually natural or essential at all? And this line of thinking led directly to what we now call queer theory. What's so amazing about it is how it took the word queer, which had been used as a weapon, as a slur, and completely reclaimed it. The whole point of queer theory is to challenge those fixed identity boxes. It argues that our identities aren't something deep inside us, but are actually subject positions that are built by the culture and the language we live in. The big idea here is something called anti-essentialism, which sounds complicated, but it just means that our identities aren't some pre-written essence inside of us. This changed everything. The goal became to question any fixed sexual identity and to deconstruct that simple black and white distinction between hetero and homosexual. Basically, to pull it apart and show that it's not so simple. And this had real-world consequences, like shifting alliances. The focus moved from gender to sexuality, which meant some lesbian theorists felt they had more in common with gay men than with straight women. So who were the architects of this massive shift? Let's talk about some of the key pioneers of modern theory who are still shaping this debate. There are so many important thinkers that our source material really points to three absolute giants in the field. You've got Gail Rubin, who did groundbreaking work on how societies decide which sexualities are good and which are bad. Then there's Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who was just central to developing queer theory and taking apart that straight/gay binary. And of course, Judith Butler, whose idea that gender is something we do, a kind of performance, has been unbelievably influential. These three really set the terms for the debate we're still having today, which leaves us with one last big mind-bending question to chew on. If our identities really are in flux, if they're not fixed things we're born with, but are shaped by our culture, then what does that mean for everything else? For how power works, for politics, and maybe most importantly, what does it mean for you? That's the question that sits right at the heart of gender studies, and it's one